the role of science, technology, and innovation in national development has been acknowledged the world over. The main difference between the so-called developing countries and developed countries can actually be explained with the way and the manner in which they have invested in and harnessed science, technology, and innovation. In fact, that would be a very easy explanation as to why most of our countries have not moved forward development-wise as compared to most of the developing countries or the newly industrialized countries. If you look at our country, Kenya, at independence in 1963, we inherited a country that was basically being run by the British. And at that time of independence, one of the issues that actually came up is that we didn't have the skills base to run the economy itself. A lot of professional and skilled work were being done by the white man. And so at independence, the government quickly realized that we were lacking the professional base to run most of the economic activities. And so one of the things that happened is that in 1965, the government published the sessional paper number 10 of 1965 on African socialism and its application to planning in Kenya. The main focus of this sessional paper really was to try and Africanize the country system, if you want, to sort of make Africans be able to take over some of the functions that the British were running before they left the country. And so a lot of focus on that sessional paper in terms of science, technology, and skills training was really on skills development, training, and transfer of some of the functions that were being done by the British. So there's a lot of focus in terms of getting the right skills and manpower to be able to manage the country's economic activities. Later in 1970s, actually in 1977, then the country enacted our Science and Technology Act, the CAP 250 of the laws of Kenya. The Science and Technology Act actually is the one that established the National Council for Science and Technology, NCST, as a machinery for the government to get scientific advice and input into government policy and guide national development. The other thing that happened with the Science and Technology Act is that it created the 5 research institutes in the country and the 5 focus areas of research. That was the Kenya Agricultural Research Institute for Agriculture, Kenya Medical Research Institute for Health, that is KEMRI. You had Kenya Marine and Fisheries, you had KIRDI, Kenya Industrial Research and Development Institute, and you had Kenya Trypanosomiasis Center as well. So what actually happened is that the Act then provided a framework within which scientific development and advisory work from science was going to feed into government programs. That actually covered the country until we came into the 1980s. Across the world in the 1980s, something began to happen, and this is the period when structural adjustment programs were coming into being. And with the advice from the World Bank, most of our countries then began a process of liberalization, began a process of cutting back on government expenditure. Remember, from 1965 to around the 1980s, what we have had is a fairly command and control structure. Government holding on to most of the functions that have to do with economic activity and economic management. From about the 1980s, now this begins to change with the push from the World Bank and IMF, and structural adjustment programs begin to come in. In 1986, then the government did a new sessional paper, number 1 of 1986, on economic management for renewed growth. And what happened in this sessional paper are 2 key things. One, you get government now beginning to divest from economic activities and focusing on creating an enabling environment for economic development to happen. The other thing that began to happen, and which is so important for this particular session, is that you begin to have government inviting the participation of the private sector into economic activity of the country. In other words, moving away from the command and control structures that the government has had since the 1960s, they're beginning to open up, and the government is moving back into their role, which is of providing right economic environment for the private sector now to begin to take over some of the functions that the government had, whether in marketing or in research. But at the same time, in this sessional paper, we see a lot of emphasis being given to research. In fact, science and technology kind of research. If you look at the area of agriculture, for example, there's emphasis now being given to breeding. There's emphasis being given to issues of food security. There's emphasis being given to issues of, getting the right varieties for the different economic zones. And one important thing is that this sessional paper begins to introduce an additional form of research funding into the system. And in this sessional paper, we then begin to see the government trying to bring commodity-specific kind of research funding. And so you begin with the export crops, for example. You begin to have Coffee Research Foundation and coffee research being funded by sales from coffee. You will see the same thing in sugar, we see the same thing in tea. In other words, apart from the funds that the government allocates for research, we are now opening up the system to allow input from private sector actors. Then when we come to the 1990s, something else happens. And that is that there's another sessional paper, number 1 of 1994, which focused on recovery and sustainable development to the year 2010. Two things begin to happen. You begin to have a government that is now beginning to think of a long-term future in terms of the focus of the policies. But more importantly, in terms of science and technology, we have the government, one, continuing the focus on commodity-specific funding as a way of encouraging research funding. But at the same time, now encouraging individuals and institutions to come in and fund research. I emphasize that because funding of research has become an issue over this period, and our investment into science and technology has become very weak. The other thing that happens is that government now begins to realize that the industry needs to work very closely with the public research institutes to take science out of the laboratory into the private sector. And therefore, the paper on 1994 emphasizes very specifically the need for industry to form contractually viable links with the research institutes to take the technologies out there. In other words, we are beginning to move out of the science for, science sake if you want, to move in science for application. And therefore, from 1994 or thereabouts, you begin to see doses of innovation. In other words, the application of science and technology for development. So concepts of science in the context of its application is beginning to take root from about the mid-1990s. And so that particular sessional paper, in terms of the science and technology development of the country, is so key because, one, public participation or private sector participation is enhanced. Two, the role of research funding and the role of private sector is enhanced. In fact, in that particular paper, there is appreciation of the role of people like East African Breweries Limited in terms of wheat and barley. There is farmers' choice, being recognized as people who can provide knowledge. Then the other thing that is introduced in that paper is the concept of participatory technology development. In other words, it is no longer then the scientists who have, the final say in terms of what happens, but participation is increased in terms of getting the beneficiaries of research and science to come and have input into what is going to happen. Then we come to the early 2000s, and we have the poverty reduction strategy papers, again being pushed by the World Bank and to a given extent the IMF. And you have a fairly consultative process of having priorities set for the country